The little girl's eyes haunted Jackson long after he'd found her standing alone on that rain-soaked highway. Those eyes, wide with fear yet somehow trusting when they met his, would change everything he thought he knew about family, forgiveness, and second chances. If you've ever believed that some people enter our lives precisely when we need them most, this story might just restore your faith in the mysterious ways the universe works. Like, subscribe, and join me on this journey of an unlikely family formed in the most unexpected circumstances. The windshield wipers fought a losing battle against the downpour as Jackson Matthews drove home from his late shift. His eyes burned with exhaustion, his mind already at home with his sleeping son. The road ahead was nearly empty at this hour, just past midnight on a Tuesday in April, when his headlights caught something that made his heart stop. A small figure stood at the roadside, drenched and motionless. Jackson slammed on his brakes, the truck skidding slightly on the wet asphalt. For a moment, he wondered if his tired mind was playing tricks on him. But as he peered through the rain-streaked window, he saw her clearly, a little girl, no older than 5 or 6, wearing pajamas and clutching what looked like a tattered stuffed rabbit. "Jesus Christ!" he muttered, throwing the truck into park and grabbing his jacket from the passenger seat. He jumped out into the rain, approaching slowly so as not to frighten her. "Hey there," he called gently over the drumming of raindrops. "Are you okay?" The girl didn't respond. Her dark hair was plastered to her pale face, and she shivered violently in the cold spring rain. As Jackson drew closer, he noticed a small backpack on her shoulders and a bruise darkening her left cheek. "I'm Jackson," he said, crouching down to her level. "What's your name?" Her lips trembled before she whispered, "Sara." "Sara, where are your parents? How did you get out here?" She clutched her rabbit tighter and shook her head, water droplets flying from her hair. "I can't go back," she said, her voice so small Jackson had to strain to hear it over the rain. "Please don't make me go back." A chill that had nothing to do with the weather ran down Jackson's spine. He'd worked enough shifts at the hospital's emergency department to recognize the signs of a child in trouble. Something was very wrong here. "You're freezing," he said, removing his jacket and wrapping it around her tiny shoulders. "Let's get you somewhere warm and safe, okay? Then we can figure things out." Sara hesitated, studying his face with an intensity that seemed beyond her years. Then, with a small nod, she allowed Jackson to guide her to his truck. As he buckled her into the passenger seat, turning the heat up full blast, Jackson's mind raced. Protocol dictated he should call the police immediately. But something in the girl's pleading eyes made him pause. He'd seen that look before, in the mirror, years ago, when he'd been a scared kid himself. "Are you hungry?" he asked, starting the engine. Sara nodded, her teeth still chattering. "I know a place that's open all night. We can get some hot chocolate and something to eat. Would that be okay?" Another nod, slightly more enthusiastic. Jackson pulled back onto the empty highway, glancing repeatedly at the small, soaked figure beside him. Who was she? Where had she come from? And what kind of parent would let their child wander onto a highway in the middle of a stormy night? His phone sat in the center console, the responsible choice just a 911 call away. But as Sara's shivering gradually subsided and her tiny hand reached out to touch the dashboard heater with wonder, Jackson made a decision that would alter the course of both their lives. "Let's get you warm first," he said, more to himself than to her. "Then we'll figure out what to do." He couldn't have known then at this moment, this simple act of compassion on a rain-slicked road would be the beginning of a journey that would test everything he believed about family, justice, and his own capacity to love. *****. 20 minutes later, they sat in a booth at Denny's, the only customers besides a truck driver nursing coffee at the counter. Sara had stopped shivering, wrapped in Jackson's jacket that swallowed her small frame. She stared with wide eyes at the chocolate chip pancakes the waitress had just set before her. "Go ahead," Jackson encouraged. "It's okay." She picked up her fork with deliberate care and took a tiny bite, then another, larger one. Soon she was eating with the abandon of a truly hungry child, chocolate smearing the corners of her mouth. Jackson sipped his coffee, watching her with growing concern. Her pajamas were worn thin at the elbows, and now that they were in the fluorescent light of the diner, he could see that the bruise on her cheek wasn't the only one. Faint marks circled her wrists like a bracelet. "Sara," he said gently when she'd slowed down. "Can you tell me where you live?" She froze, fork halfway to her mouth. "I don't want to go back there." "I understand. But I need to know where your parents are. They must be worried about you." Sara set down her fork and looked directly at him. "My mom is gone. She went to heaven when I was little. And he's—" She trailed off, her eyes dropping to her plate. "He's who, Sara? Your dad?" She shook her head. "Mom's friend. He said I have to call him Dad, but he's not. He gets really mad sometimes." Jackson felt a knot forming in his stomach. He was all too familiar with this story, had seen its aftermath in the emergency room more times than he cared to remember. "Is he the one who hurt you?" he asked, keeping his voice neutral despite the anger building inside him. Sara didn't answer directly. Instead, she said, "I ran away. I took the bus as far as I could, but then I had to walk. I was trying to find my grandma's house, but I got lost." "Where does your grandma live?" "I don't know. Mom said she lives in the mountains where the air smells like pine trees." Sara's eyes welled with tears. "I thought if I walked far enough, I'd find her." Jackson's heart broke a little. This child had been walking, alone, trying to find a grandmother she might never have even met, based on nothing more than a vague description of pine trees. "Sara, I need to call someone who can help us. There are people whose job it is to make sure kids are safe." Panic flashed across her face. "No! He'll find me. He said if I ever told anyone, they'd take me away to a bad place where no one would ever love me." "That's not true," Jackson said firmly. "I promise you, Sara. No one is going to send you to a bad place." But even as he said it, Jackson knew the system wasn't perfect. He'd seen too many kids bounce from one foster home to another, some falling through the cracks entirely. His own childhood had been a testament to that broken system. Sara seemed to sense his hesitation. "Please," she whispered. "Can't I just stay with you? Just for tonight?" Jackson ran a hand through his hair. He had a 6-year-old son at home, being watched by Mrs. Patel from next door. He was a single father with barely enough time and resources for one child, let alone two. And harboring a runaway child, no matter how justified her reasons, was almost certainly illegal. But looking at Sara's hopeful face, Jackson couldn't bring himself to make the call that might send her back into harm's way, or into the uncertain maze of child protective services. "Just for tonight," he found himself saying. "And tomorrow, we'll figure this out properly. I promise." Relief washed over Sara's face, and she resumed eating her pancakes with renewed enthusiasm. Jackson watched her, wondering what he'd just gotten himself into. He was a nurse, a father, a man who'd worked hard to build a stable life after his own chaotic childhood. He knew better than to make impulsive decisions like this. And yet, as Sara offered him a small, chocolate-smeared smile, he couldn't help feeling that sometimes the right choice and the responsible choice weren't necessarily the same thing. *****. The drive home was quiet, Sara fighting to keep her eyes open in the passenger seat. By the time Jackson pulled into his driveway, she was fast asleep, her head lolling against the window, the stuffed rabbit clutched tightly to her chest. He carried her inside, careful not to wake her, and was met by Mrs. Patel, his elderly neighbor who often watched his son Ethan when Jackson worked late shifts. "Who is this?" she whispered, her eyes wide with surprise. "It's complicated," Jackson replied quietly. "I found her alone on the highway. I'll explain everything tomorrow, but could you keep this between us for now?" Mrs. Patel studied him for a moment, then nodded. She'd known Jackson for 5 years, had watched him raise Ethan alone after his wife's death, and trusted his judgment. "Your secret is safe with me. But be careful, Jackson. The world is not always kind to those with good intentions." After Mrs. Patel left, Jackson settled Sara on the couch, covering her with a blanket. He checked on Ethan, who was sound asleep in his room, surrounded by his beloved dinosaur collection. Looking at his son's peaceful face, Jackson felt a pang of doubt. Was he putting his own child at risk by bringing a stranger into their home? But Sara wasn't just any stranger. She was a child in danger, with no one else to turn to. If the situations were reversed, wouldn't he want someone to help Ethan? Jackson spent a restless night in the armchair across from the couch, watching Sara sleep and wondering what morning would bring. He must have dozed off eventually, because he woke to the sound of whispers and giggles. Opening his eyes, he found Ethan and Sara sitting cross-legged on the living room floor, examining Ethan's prized collection of dinosaur figurines. "This one's a Triceratops," Ethan was explaining importantly. "He's a herbivore, which means he only eats plants." "Like a vegetarian?" Sara asked, carefully holding the plastic dinosaur. "Exactly. You're smart." Jackson watched them, amazed at how quickly children could form connections. Ethan, usually shy around strangers, seemed completely at ease with Sara. "Morning, Dad," Ethan called when he noticed Jackson was awake. "Is Sara going to stay with us?" "She doesn't know any dinosaur names, but I'm teaching her." "Good morning, buddy. Sara's going to stay with us just for a little while until we can find her family." Sara's face fell at the mention of family, but she quickly returned to examining the dinosaurs, avoiding Jackson's eyes. Over breakfast, pancakes again, at Ethan's insistence, Jackson tried to learn more about Sara's situation. Between bites, she revealed fragments. Her mother had died when she was 3. Her mother's boyfriend, Derek, had taken her in. They lived in an apartment where the neighbors fought a lot. Derek drank the angry juice, and sometimes locked her in the closet when she was bad. Each revelation made Jackson's resolve strengthen. He couldn't send her back to that environment. But what were his alternatives? After breakfast, while the kids watched cartoons, Jackson made 2 phone calls. The first was to the hospital, calling in sick for his shift that day, something he almost never did. The second was to his friend Miguel, a social worker he met through the hospital. "I need advice," Jackson said when Miguel answered. "Hypothetically, if someone found a child who was clearly being abused, but the child is terrified of being put into the system, what options would that person have?" There was a long pause before Miguel replied. "Jackson, what have you gotten yourself into?" "Just answer the question." "Hypothetically." Miguel sighed. "Hypothetically, that person should report it immediately. But realistically? The system is overloaded. Without clear evidence of severe abuse or neglect, and without knowing the child's full name or the abuser's identity, it might be hard to ensure the child doesn't end up back in the same situation, or worse. What about emergency fostering? It takes time to get approved, even for emergency situations. And if you're talking about yourself, which I suspect you are, being a single dad already might complicate things." Jackson watched Sara laugh at something on the TV, her face lighting up in a way that made her look like any other carefree child. "What if," he said slowly, "the child might have a grandmother somewhere? Someone who could take her in permanently? That would be ideal. Family placement is always preferred. But you need to find this grandmother, prove the relationship, and still involve CPS in the process." After hanging up, Jackson sat at his kitchen table, weighing his options. The right thing to do, legally, was clear. But the right thing for Sara was much less certain. A small hand touched his arm, startling him from his thoughts. Sara stood beside him, her dark eyes serious. "Are you going to call the police now?" she asked. Jackson hesitated. "I'm trying to figure out what's best for you, Sara. I want you to be safe." "I feel safe here," she said simply. "With you and Ethan." Before Jackson could respond, Ethan bounded into the kitchen. "Dad! Can we go to the park? I want to show Sara the duck pond." Looking at their expectant faces, Jackson made another decision that strayed from protocol. "Sure, buddy. Let's all go to the park." ****. The next few days fell into a strange, temporary rhythm. Jackson called in for personal leave at work, citing a family emergency. He enrolled Sara in Ethan's school as a visiting relative, using vague explanations that the harried school secretary didn't question too deeply. In the evenings, the three of them ate dinner together, played board games, and watched movies. To an outside observer, they might have looked like any normal family. But Jackson knew this precarious arrangement couldn't last. Each night after the children were asleep, he searched online for missing person reports, for any mention of a girl named Sara matching her description. He found nothing. He also searched for clues about Sara's grandmother, women living in mountainous areas within driving distance, property records for anyone who might be related to Sara. But without knowing her full name or her mother's name, he hit dead end after dead end. On the fourth day, while the kids were at school, Jackson was sorting through Sara's small backpack, hoping to find something, anything, that might help identify her family. Among her meager possessions, a change of clothes, a toothbrush, and a few granola bars, he found a worn photograph tucked into a side pocket. It showed a young woman with Sara's dark eyes and smile, holding a baby that must have been Sara. They stood in front of a cabin, pine trees visible in the background. The woman wore a necklace with a distinctive pendant, a silver tree of life. Jackson turned the photo over. Written on the back in faded ink were the words, "Emma and Sara, Pine Ridge, 2020. Emma. Sara's mother's name was Emma. With this new information, Jackson's search took on renewed focus. He looked up Pine Ridge and found several locations with that name across 3 neighboring states. He searched for property records under the name Emma in those areas, and for obituaries from around the time Sara said her mother died. By the time he needed to pick the children up from school, he had a lead, an obituary for Emma Lawson, age 28, who had died 3 years ago in Pine Ridge, Colorado. The obituary mentioned she was survived by a daughter, Sara, and her mother, Katherine Lawson. Katherine Lawson, Sara's grandmother. Further searching revealed that Katherine still lived in Pine Ridge, in a cabin that had been in the family for generations. Jackson found a phone number and sat staring at it, his finger hovering over the call button. What would he say? "Hello, I found your granddaughter on the side of the road, and I've been keeping her at my house for days without notifying authorities." How could he explain his actions without sounding like a kidnapper himself? Before he could decide, his phone rang. The school. Ethan had fallen on the playground and needed to be picked up early. The call to Katherine Lawson would have to wait. Asterisk asterisk asterisk. That evening, with Ethan nursing a scraped knee and both children engrossed in a movie, Jackson finally made the call. A woman with a warm, slightly gravelly voice answered on the third ring. "Hello? Is this Katherine Lawson?" Jackson asked, his heart pounding. "Yes, it is. Who's calling?" Jackson took a deep breath. "My name is Jackson Matthews. I'm calling about your granddaughter, Sara." There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end. "Sara? Is she all right? What's happened?" The fear in her voice confirmed Jackson's suspicions. This woman cared deeply for Sara. "She's safe," he assured her quickly. "She's with me and my son. I found her a few days ago, alone on the highway about 50 miles east of Denver." "Oh my God!" Katherine whispered. "I've been trying to find her for over a year. That monster wouldn't let me see her after Emma died." He cut off all contact. Katherine's voice broke. "How did she end up on a highway? Where has she been all this time?" Jackson explained what little he knew about Sara's situation with Derek, careful to keep his voice low so the children wouldn't overhear. "I knew it," Katherine said, anger replacing her initial shock. "I filed reports with CPS. I tried to get custody. But he moved them around, and without Emma's parental rights being formally transferred to me before she died, the court said Derek had established himself as her de facto guardian." She paused. "Mr. Matthews, why didn't you call the police when you found her?" It was the question Jackson had been dreading, the one that exposed his actions as well-intentioned but potentially illegal. "She was terrified," he said simply. Terrified of being sent back to him, terrified of the system. I'm a nurse. I've seen too many kids fall through the cracks. I wanted to make sure she'd be safe before I involved authorities. There was a long silence, and Jackson braced himself for judgment or accusations. Instead, Katherine said, "Thank you. Thank you for protecting her when I couldn't." Relief washed over Jackson. "I think she was trying to find you. She mentioned her grandmother lived where the air smells like pine trees." Katherine laughed softly, though it sounded close to a sob. That's how Emma always described our home to her. Where the air smells like pine trees and the stars shine brighter than anywhere else. They talked for nearly an hour, making plans. Katherine would drive to Denver the next day, a journey of about 4 hours from Pine Ridge. She had documentation proving her relationship to Sara, birth certificates, photos, even court papers from her previous attempts to gain custody. "We'll still need to involve the authorities," Jackson warned, "to make everything legal." "I know," Katherine agreed. "But with Sara physically safe with me, and evidence of Derek's abuse, I think we'll have a stronger case this time." After hanging up, Jackson sat in the quiet kitchen, emotions swirling. He was relieved to have found Sara's grandmother, someone who clearly loved her and wanted her. But he was also surprised by a pang of sadness at the thought of Sara leaving. In just a few days, she had carved out a space in their lives. Ethan had blossomed with her around, taking on the role of protective older brother despite being only months apart in age. And Jackson himself had found unexpected joy in caring for this additional child, in watching her gradually relax and trust and even smile. He rejoined the children in the living room, where the movie was ending. Sara looked up at him, her eyes questioning, as if she sensed something had changed. "I have some news," Jackson said, sitting between them on the couch. "Sara, I found your grandmother." Sara's eyes widened. "My real grandma? The one in the mountains?" Jackson nodded. "Her name is Katherine, and she lives in a place called Pine Ridge, where the air really does smell like pine trees. She's been looking for you for a very long time, and she's coming here tomorrow to see you." Sara's reaction was complex, joy and uncertainty battling across her face. "Will she take me away?" "She wants you to live with her, yes. She's your family, Sara." "But..." Sara looked at Ethan, then back at Jackson. "You're my family now, too." Ethan grabbed Sara's hand. "Dad, can't she stay with us? Please?" Jackson pulled both children into a hug. "Sometimes family isn't just the people you live with. Your grandmother loves you very much, Sara, and she can give you a good home. But that doesn't mean we can't still be part of your life. Promise?" Sara whispered against his shoulder. "I promise," Jackson said, though he knew such promises were complicated. Katherine lived hours away, and he had no legal connection to Sara. But in that moment, he meant it with his whole heart. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Katherine Lawson arrived the next morning, a tall woman with silver-streaked dark hair and Sara's eyes. She stood on Jackson's doorstep clutching a folder of documents, and looking both hopeful and terrified. Sara hid behind Jackson when he opened the door, suddenly shy. "Sara," Katherine said softly, kneeling down to be at eye level. "Do you remember me? I used to sing you lullabies when you were very little." Sara peeked around Jackson's leg. "Did you have a cat named Butterscotch?" Katherine's face lit up. "Yes. You remember. Butterscotch is still with me, and he's gotten very fat and lazy." Slowly, Sara emerged from behind Jackson. "Mom showed me pictures of you. She said you make the best cookies in the world." "I still do," Katherine said, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "And I've been saving all my best recipes to teach you." The ice broken, Sara allowed Katherine to hug her, though she kept glancing back at Jackson and Ethan, as if to make sure they weren't disappearing. Over coffee, while the children played in Ethan's room, Jackson and Katherine discussed next steps. They agreed to go to the police together that afternoon, with Katherine bringing her documentation and Jackson explaining how he found Sara. "They might charge me with something," Jackson admitted. "I should have reported finding her immediately." Katherine shook her head. I won't let that happen. You saved her, Mr. Matthews. If you had followed protocol, who knows where she might have ended up while the system tried to locate me? Call me Jackson, please. Katherine smiled. Jackson. I can never repay what you've done for Sara. For both of us. Seeing her safe and happy will be payment enough, Jackson said, though he couldn't quite ignore the heaviness in his chest at the thought of saying goodbye. The visit to the police station was tense but ultimately productive. The officers were initially suspicious of Jackson's actions but softened when they understood the full story. Katherine's documentation was thorough, and Sara's account of Derek's abuse, given to a specially trained officer while Katherine and Jackson waited anxiously, was deemed credible enough to warrant an investigation. By evening, temporary custody arrangements had been made. Sara would go home with Katherine while the courts processed the formal custody application and the police investigated Derek. Jackson and Ethan were allowed to say a proper goodbye, with promises of visits and phone calls. I don't want to go, Sara cried, clinging to Jackson. Can't you come with us? Jackson knelt down, gently wiping her tears. Your grandmother's house is far from here, and Ethan and I have our lives in Denver. But this isn't goodbye forever. It's just goodbye for now. Like see you later? Sara asked, hiccuping through her tears. Exactly like that, Jackson assured her. And you know what? Your grandmother lives where the air smells like pine trees. That sounds like a pretty magical place to me. Ethan gave Sara his favorite Triceratops figure. So you don't forget about dinosaurs, he said solemnly. As Katherine's car pulled away, Sara's small face pressed against the back window. Jackson felt a complex mix of emotions, sadness at the parting, joy at having helped reunite Sara with her grandmother, and a strange sense of loss for a future that had briefly seemed possible. Dad? Ethan asked, his hands slipping into Jackson's as they watched the car disappear down the street. Are we ever going to see Sara again? Jackson squeezed his son's hand. I'm going to do everything I can to make sure we do, buddy. Asterisk. The weeks that followed were an adjustment. Ethan asked about Sara constantly, and Jackson found himself missing her presence in their home. The extra plate at the dinner table, the sound of children's laughter multiplied. They spoke with Sara and Katherine on video calls twice a week. Sara was flourishing in Pine Ridge, attending a small local school and helping her grandmother tend to a vegetable garden. The investigation into Derek was progressing, with police discovering he had a record of domestic violence charges from before he met Emma. A month after Sara left, Katherine called with news. The courts had granted her permanent custody of Sara, and Derek was facing charges for child endangerment and abuse. We're having a small celebration this weekend, Katherine said. Nothing fancy, just a little gathering to mark our new beginning. Sara would love it if you and Ethan could come. Jackson hesitated. The drive to Pine Ridge was long, and he had work commitments. But looking at Ethan's hopeful face as he listened to the conversation, Jackson knew what his answer would be. We'll be there, he promised. The drive to Pine Ridge that weekend was beautiful, the road winding through increasingly mountainous terrain until they reached Katherine's cabin, nestled among tall pines just as Sara had described. The air did indeed smell of pine, crisp and clean in a way city air never could be. Sara ran out to meet them, throwing herself into Jackson's arms with such force he nearly fell over. She looked different already, her face fuller, her eyes brighter, the haunted look replaced by childish exuberance. You came! You really came! She exclaimed, then grabbed Ethan's hand. Come see my room! Grandma let me paint it purple, and I have a window seat where you can see deer in the morning. The children disappeared into the cabin, leaving Jackson and Katherine standing in the yard. She's doing well, Jackson observed. Katherine nodded. Better than I dared hope. The nightmares are less frequent now, and she's making friends at school. She paused. She talks about you and Ethan all the time. You made quite an impression. She made one on us too, Jackson admitted. Inside, Katherine had prepared a feast, roast chicken, mashed potatoes, and the famous cookies Sara had mentioned. The cabin was cozy and warm, filled with books and handmade quilts and photographs of 3 generations of women who shared the same dark eyes. After dinner, while the children played a board game by the fireplace, Katherine brought out a bottle of wine and 2 glasses. "I have a proposition for you, Jackson," she said, filling the glasses. "I've been thinking about this for weeks." Jackson raised an eyebrow. "I'm intrigued. Pine Ridge has a small medical clinic that's desperately understaffed. They've been trying to recruit a nurse practitioner for months." She took a sip of wine. "I did some research. With your experience, you'd be qualified. The pay isn't as good as a big city hospital, but the cost of living here is much lower." Jackson stared at her, processing the implication. "You're suggesting we move here? To Pine Ridge?" Katherine nodded. "There's a small house for rent just down the road. 2 bedrooms, a decent yard. The school is excellent, only 12 kids per class. And Sara." She glanced at the children. "Sara would have her family close by. All of her family." It was a radical proposition. Leave the city, his job, the life he'd built for himself and Ethan after his wife died. Start over in a small mountain town where he knew no one except a woman he'd met a month ago, and a child who had stumbled into his life by chance. And yet, watching Sara and Ethan laughing together by the fire, Jackson felt something he hadn't experienced in a long time, the sense that he was exactly where he was meant to be. "I need to think about it," he said carefully. "Talk to Ethan, look into the job, the school." Katherine smiled. "Of course. There's no rush. But the offer is there." Later that night, as Jackson tucked Ethan into the guest room bed, his son asked sleepily, "Dad, can we live here? With Sara and Ms. Katherine? Would you like that, buddy? It would mean changing schools, leaving your friends in Denver." Ethan nodded without hesitation. "I like it here. The air smells good, and Sara needs us." Out of the mouths of babes, Jackson thought. Asterisk asterisk asterisk. 2 months later, Jackson and Ethan moved to Pine Ridge. The transition wasn't without challenges. Jackson had to complete additional certifications for the clinic position. Ethan was initially shy at his new school, and the first winter brought more snow than either of them had ever seen. But there were joys too. Ethan and Sara became inseparable, their bond growing stronger as they explored the forests around the cabin, built snow forts in winter, and attended the tiny local school together. Jackson found the pace of rural medicine different but rewarding, with more time to know his patients as people rather than just collections of symptoms. And then there was Katherine, whose friendship had evolved into something Jackson hadn't expected. They shared parenting duties, taking turns driving the children to activities or helping with homework. They cooked meals together, Katherine teaching Jackson her family recipes while he introduced her to dishes from his own childhood. In the evenings, after the children were asleep, they often sat on the porch of Katherine's cabin, talking for hours under the impossibly bright stars. It was during one such evening, nearly a year after Jackson had found Sara on that rainy highway, that Katherine broached a subject they'd both been circling. "The children have been asking questions," she said, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea. "About us. About what we are to each other." Jackson nodded. Their arrangement was unconventional, 2 households functioning almost as one, with the children moving freely between them, all 4 of them sharing most meals and activities. "What did you tell them?" he asked. "That we're figuring it out," Katherine replied with a small smile. "That families come in all shapes and sizes, and ours is still finding its shape." Jackson reached across the space between their chairs and took her hand. "And what shape do you think that might be eventually?" Katherine's fingers tightened around his. "I think you know." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars and listening to the wind in the pines. Neither felt the need to define what was growing between them, not yet. They had time. For now, it was enough to know that what had begun with a lost child on a rainy night had led them all exactly where they needed to be. Asterisk asterisk asterisk. 5 years later, the cabin had been expanded to accommodate their blended family. Jackson and Katherine had married in a simple ceremony by the lake, with Sara and Ethan proudly serving as their attendants. The clinic had grown too, with Jackson now serving as its director. Katherine continued to teach at the local school, her classroom often filled with projects inspired by the nature surrounding Pine Ridge. Sara, now 11, had blossomed into a confident, kind-hearted girl with a passion for photography, capturing the beauty of the mountains that had been her mother's home. The trauma of her early years had faded, though not disappeared entirely. Occasionally, she still had nightmares that sent her seeking reassurance from Jackson or Katherine. But those nights grew increasingly rare. Ethan, 12 and gangly, had maintained his love of dinosaurs but added geology to his interests, his pockets perpetually filled with rocks and fossils found in the hills around their home. He and Sara bickered like biological siblings but defended each other fiercely to the outside world. On the anniversary of the night Jackson found Sara, a date they now celebrated as Family Finding Day, they always took a hike to Katherine's favorite overlook, where the entire valley spread below them in panoramic splendor. "I still can't believe how it all worked out," Jackson said, his arm around Katherine's waist as they watched the children scrambling ahead on the trail. "If I hadn't been working that late shift, if I'd taken a different route home, if Sara hadn't been brave enough to run away, if she hadn't remembered what Emma told her about pine trees," Katherine continued. "Some things are just meant to be," Sara called back over her shoulder, having overheard them. "That's what Mom used to say." Jackson smiled, thinking of all the unlikely coincidences and choices that had led them here, to this family that had found each other against all odds. A family formed not by blood or obligation, but by compassion, courage, and love. As they reached the overlook, the valley stretching endlessly before them, Jackson gathered them all into a group hug. Sara's words echoed in his mind, "Some things are just meant to be." Perhaps she was right. Perhaps some souls are destined to find each other, no matter what obstacles stand in their way. And perhaps the families we create, the ones we choose and who choose us in return, are the most precious of all. The little girl's eyes that had haunted Jackson that rainy night now sparkled with joy and belonging. In saving Sara, he had found a completeness to his own life that he hadn't known was missing. And in that moment, surrounded by the family he never expected to have, Jackson knew with absolute certainty that sometimes, the most beautiful journeys begin with a single act of kindness on a dark and lonely road. If you found this story touching, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more heartwarming tales of unexpected family bonds and second chances. Remember that compassion can change lives in ways we never imagine. Sometimes, it only takes one person willing to stop on a rainy night to set in motion a chain of events that leads to healing, love, and the creation of a family where none existed before.